Jackson Cole arrived at Westfield University's graduation ceremony in a faded flannel shirt and scuffed boots, the kind of man security guards noticed immediately. Two of them approached before he even reached his assigned seat. "Sir, you need to leave." The words cut through the celebratory noise like a blade. Jackson said nothing. He simply stood, weathered hands at his sides as they gripped his arms and walked him toward the exit doors. The auditorium fell quiet. Then, from the back rows, 10 men in navy dress whites rose to their feet simultaneously, and everything everyone thought they knew collapsed. What secret did Jackson carry that made 10 elite warriors stand at attention? Stay with this story to find out. The garage opened before sunrise. It always did. Cole's Auto Repair sat on the edge of Raleigh's industrial district, a modest concrete building with 2 bay doors and a hand-painted sign that had been fading for the better part of a decade. Jackson had never replaced the sign. He told himself it was because the business ran on reputation, not advertising, and that was true enough. But the deeper truth was that he simply did not think about the sign very often, because he did not spend much time thinking about appearances. He moved through the early morning the way he moved through most things. Quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. By 7 in the morning, he had already finished rotating the tires on a Ford pickup that had been sitting in Bay 1 since Tuesday, logged the invoice into his notebook by hand, and swept the oil-stained concrete floor with a push broom. His hands were dark with grease at the knuckles despite the gloves he wore, and he wiped them on a shop rag that had long ago stopped being any particular color. He looked at the wall clock above the workbench. 3 hours and 40 minutes. He had been watching that clock since 4 in the morning. There was a back room behind the garage, not much more than a utility room with a cot, a small bathroom, and a dresser that had belonged to his father. Jackson did not live there exactly, but he spent enough nights there that the distinction had blurred over the years. His actual house was 11 minutes away, a 2-bedroom ranch-style property with a yard that needed attention and a kitchen that cooked for one. He had bought it the same year he opened the garage. Both purchases had been practical decisions made by a man who was very good at making practical decisions and considerably less skilled at anything that required sitting still. He showered in the utility room, changed into his best flannel shirt, dark green, no fraying at the collar, pressed khaki trousers, and a pair of leather shoes he kept in a box specifically for occasions like this one. He stood in front of the small mirror above the bathroom sink for a long moment. What looked back at him was a man of 48 with a broad jaw, deeply set eyes, and a network of fine lines around his mouth that had come from years of squinting into difficult situations. There were 2 small scars on his left wrist. He did not look at them. On the passenger seat of his gray 3/4-ton truck sat a white envelope. Elijah had mailed it 3 weeks earlier from his campus apartment, along with a card that contained exactly one sentence written in his son's blocky, unhurried handwriting: "You just have to show up. That's all." Jackson had read it once, set it on the kitchen counter, and then read it 4 more times over the following days without admitting to himself that he was doing it. The envelope held 2 things: a graduation ceremony ticket for Section A, Row 3, Seat 14, and a printed copy of the program with Elijah's name highlighted in yellow marker. Jackson did not need the program. He had memorized the time, the location, the parking instructions, and the dress code within an hour of receiving the packet. Planning was not something he had ever needed to be taught. It was something that had been trained into him at a level deep enough that it no longer felt like a skill. It simply felt like breathing. He did not think much about what the day would look like beyond his son walking across a stage. He had no expectation of being recognized, no anticipation of conversation, no social agenda beyond finding seat 14 and being in it when Elijah's name was called. That was the mission. It always helped to reduce things to their essential objective. He turned the key in the ignition, pulled out of the gravel lot, and headed east on Tryon Street toward the university. Westfield University had been established in 1891 as a college of engineering and applied sciences, and over the following century it had grown into one of the most respected technical institutions in the southeastern United States. Its main campus occupied 160 acres of manicured grounds in the northern quarter of Raleigh, anchored at its center by Whitmore Auditorium, a building that seated 2,000 and had, in the past decade, undergone a renovation funded almost entirely by a single endowment. The name on the endowment was Harlow. It was also the name on the plaque beside the auditorium's main entrance, the science building's east wing, and the garden courtyard between the law library and the student union. The Harlow family had been connected to Westfield for 40 years. Margaret Harlow had been connected to it personally for 32. She arrived in a black sedan with tinted rear windows at 9:45, precisely 15 minutes before the doors opened to guests. Her assistant, a young woman named Giselle who had held the position for 11 months and had learned to anticipate Margaret's preferences with near-perfect accuracy, held an umbrella over her employer despite the fact that the morning sky was clear. Margaret did not comment on this. She accepted the consideration as a matter of course, the way people who have been accustomed to deference for long enough stop registering it as deference at all. She wore a steel blue suit with a single strand of pearls, her silver hair set in the precise style she had maintained for the better part of 2 decades. She was 63 years old, the widow of Robert Harlow, founder of Harlow Industries, a defense contracting firm that had employed 4,000 people at its peak, and she had served as chair of the Westfield University Board of Trustees for 3 consecutive terms. She was not a cruel woman. That was important to understand. She was a woman who had spent her entire adult life in environments where status was the primary organizing principle, and who had, over time, come to experience that principle not as a preference but as a natural law. She sorted people. She did so without malice and without much deliberation. It was simply how she processed the world. Cameron Brooks, the university's director of event security, met her at the entrance with a clipboard and a firm handshake. Cameron was 41, ex-law enforcement, and deeply attentive to the hierarchy of any room he entered. He had arranged the afternoon's security deployment. 4 permanent staff, 6 contracted additions, and 2 individuals he had brought in specifically for the VIP and reserved seating sections. A pair named Hunter Briggs and Connor Walsh, both former private sector security, both recommended through a contact Margaret's office had used before. Cameron had reviewed the seating chart personally. Section A, the front 12 rows, was designated for families of honor graduates, board members, and invited faculty. The rest of the auditorium filled in from sections B through F with the standing room gallery above. It was a system Margaret had approved, as she approved most systems that touched the event's presentation. Order mattered to her. The right people in the right places was not snobbery in her understanding. It was stewardship. Charlotte Reeves arrived at the press check-in table at 9:58 with a camera bag over one shoulder and a coffee going cold in her other hand. She was 34, a staff reporter for the Raleigh Independent who had been covering education and community affairs for 6 years. The assignment that morning was a feature on the graduating class's top engineering students, 3 of whom had already accepted positions with national firms, 1 of whom had turned down a corporate offer to start a nonprofit. Good stories, clean narratives. She collected her press lanyard, found a position near the left aisle of Section C where she had a clean sightline to both the stage and the main floor, and set up her equipment with the practiced economy of someone who had done this in crowded rooms many times. She was not expecting anything unusual. Graduations were, in her experience, reliably predictable, which was why the story she would end up filing that afternoon would still feel, years later, like something that had happened in a dream. Jackson found the parking lot without difficulty and walked to the main entrance through a stream of families dressed for the occasion. He did not draw attention in the way a person who felt out of place might. There was no hesitation in his stride, no self-conscious touching of his collar. He simply walked the way he walked everywhere, with his weight balanced evenly, his pace measured, his eyes moving in the relaxed but continuous scan of a man who had learned, in contexts that no longer applied to his current life, never to stop reading a room. He held his envelope at his side and joined the line at the entrance check. The first point of friction was small and almost unremarkable. A young door attendant, new to the job and visibly nervous, misread the section code on Jackson's ticket and directed him towards Section C. Jackson looked at the ticket, then at the door attendant, and calmly pointed out the discrepancy. The young man apologized, checked his chart again, and confirmed that yes, row 3, Section A was correct. He walked Jackson toward the proper entrance. That was where Hunter Briggs was standing. Hunter was 6 feet 2, with a military-cut hairline and a posture that communicated authority without requiring words. He had worked private security for 7 years after a brief and unremarkable career in law enforcement, and he had developed in that time a set of instincts that he trusted entirely and examined rarely. He saw Jackson from 20 feet away. He noted the flannel shirt. He noted the boots. He noted the absence of a suit jacket and the presence of a worn leather watch band. He made a decision in approximately 2 seconds, and then he stepped forward to intercept the door attendant before Jackson could be directed to his seat. "Sir," Hunter's voice was professionally neutral, "I need to verify your ticket." Jackson handed it over without comment. Hunter held it at arm's length, turning it in the light as though inspecting currency. The ticket was entirely legitimate, printed on the university's official stock, with the correct barcode, section designation, and event date. Hunter knew this. He looked at it anyway for a beat longer than any verification required. "This ticket is for Section A," Hunter said. "Yes," Jackson said. "Are you affiliated with one of the honor graduates?" "My son is graduating today." Hunter nodded slowly. "And your son's name?" "Elijah Cole." Another pause. Hunter glanced past Jackson's shoulder. A subtle gesture, but Charlotte Reeves, watching from 30 feet away with her camera hanging at her side, caught it. Hunter was looking toward Cameron Brooks, who was stationed near the auditorium's side entrance. The look lasted less than a second. Then Hunter returned his attention to Jackson with an expression that had shifted in a way that was difficult to name precisely. Something between performed concern and settled certainty. "Mr. Cole, Section A requires supplemental verification this year, a secondary credential issued by the registrar's office alongside the printed ticket. It's a new protocol." Hunter's tone was even almost apologetic. "Almost. Do you have that secondary credential?" Jackson looked at him. "I wasn't informed of any secondary credential. It was communicated in a follow-up email to all Section A guests approximately 10 days ago." This was false, and both men existed on different sides of knowing it. Jackson had received no such email because no such email existed. He had his ticket, his son's handwritten note, and 21 years of operational experience that had taught him to read the space between what people said and what they meant. He understood exactly what was happening. He also understood that making a scene in the entrance hall of his son's graduation ceremony, drawing his son into an ugly dispute on a day that was supposed to be about none of this, was not something he was willing to do. "Is there someone from the registrar's office I can speak with?" he asked. "The registrar's office closed at 8 this morning to prepare for the event." "I see." Jackson was quiet for a moment. The stream of families continued to flow around them the way water moves around stones. He looked at Hunter with the even unreadable expression of a man who had been trained to reveal nothing in the face of pressure and had practiced that training long enough that it had become his resting state. "So there's nothing that can be done. I'm sorry for the inconvenience. We can certainly find you a seat in Section C or D." At that point, Connor Walsh appeared on Jackson's left side. He had approached without announcement, positioning himself at an angle that completed a visual triangle. Hunter in front, Connor to the left, the entrance wall to the right. It was the geometry of managed removal, dressed in the language of customer service. Connor said nothing. He did not need to. Charlotte lowered her camera. Something had shifted in her attention, a tuning fork vibration that experienced journalists learned to trust and stop trying to fully explain. She raised her phone instead, opened the camera application, and pressed record. Jackson looked at the two men. He looked at the open auditorium entrance where the first strains of the ceremony's prelude music drifted out from within. He thought of the ticket in Hunter's hand. He thought of the envelope on the passenger seat of his truck, and the one sentence written in his son's handwriting, and the fact that what Elijah had asked of him, the only thing, was that he show up. He had shown up. What happened after that was not something he was going to fight about in a doorway. "All right," he said, just the one word. He took his ticket back from Hunter, folded it once, and put it in his shirt pocket. They walked him through the center of Whitmore Auditorium. Hunter led, Connor followed, and Jackson moved between them with a steadiness that seemed to the people who turned to watch almost impossible given the circumstances. Because they did turn. The auditorium was filling. Perhaps 800 people already in their seats, and the human instinct to notice a disruption in a crowd is primal and immediate. Heads swiveled. Conversations dropped to murmurs. A woman 3 rows in leaned toward her husband and said something behind her hand. A man in a gray suit at the end of a row stood up slightly to see better, then sat back down with an expression of vague discomfort. The ceremony's prelude music continued without interruption. A string quartet arrangement of something classical played through the hall's speaker system, delicate and unhurried, entirely indifferent to what was moving through the aisles below it. That contrast, the lightness of the music against the weight of what was happening on the floor, was the detail that would stay with Charlotte longest in the months that followed. Diana Ashworth, president of Westfield University, was standing in the left wing of the stage with her commencement remarks in one hand and a bottle of water in the other when she noticed the movement on the main floor. She was 56, a woman who had spent 3 decades in academic administration and could read the temperature of a large room the way other people read thermostats. She saw Jackson. She saw Hunter and Connor flanking him. She understood what she was looking at, and she felt, in the space between one breath and the next, a clench of something that was not quite dread but was close to it. She looked toward the front row of Section A, where Margaret Harlow sat with her hands folded in her lap, her gaze directed at the empty stage with the serene detachment of someone who has already decided the outcome of an event and is simply waiting for the world to catch up. Diana knew. She knew who had initiated this, and she knew why, and she also knew that she was the president of this university, and that Margaret Harlow's family had endowed 2 buildings and chaired the board for 11 years, and that the particular arithmetic of institutional power did not always resolve the way that fairness demanded. She pressed her lips together. She stayed in the wing. Cameron Brooks watched the 3 men cross the floor from his position near the side entrance and felt, beneath the practiced composure he wore on the job, something starting to tighten in his chest. He had made the call. Margaret had spoken to him in the quiet corridor outside the board reception room, a 40-second conversation that contained no explicit instruction in every implication. He had called Hunter. He had told him to use his judgment. He had understood what judgment meant in that context, and he had allowed it to proceed, and now he was watching it proceed in front of 800 people and 1 reporter with her phone raised, and the tightening in his chest was the particular discomfort of a man recognizing, too late, the distance between what he had permitted and what he could defend. Margaret did not turn around. She sat with her hands folded and her eyes forward. She was a woman who believed in composure under any circumstance, and she maintained it now. They reached the exit doors, 2 panels of heavy oak, each fitted with a horizontal push bar, a rim of afternoon light coming in around the edges. Jackson stopped, not resisting, not stiffening, just stopped the way a man stops when he reaches the last moment before an irreversible thing. He faced the doors. Behind him, the auditorium stretched back through the music and the murmuring and the hundreds of people who were no longer pretending not to watch. Hunter stepped alongside him and spoke quietly, his voice calibrated so that only Jackson could hear. "This venue isn't the right fit for everyone," he said. "I think you understand what I mean." It was not profane. It was not shouted. It was delivered with the particular precision of someone who knows that the most effective cruelty travels in a low voice, wearing the mask of reason. Jackson stood with his shoulders square and his chin level and his hands completely still at his sides. He had been shot at. He had operated in temperatures cold enough to impair motor function and heat so extreme that the air itself became a physical obstacle. He had sat in silence for 72 hours in a hide position in the Kunar province waiting for a window that might not come. Hunter Briggs's quiet voice in the lobby of a university was not the hardest thing he had ever absorbed. But it was, in its own particular way, the one that required the most from him. Because this was not about him. It was never about him. It was about being on the other side of those doors when his son's name was called. He closed his eyes for 1 second, then he opened them and looked at the door. And then, from somewhere in the back of the auditorium, a chair scraped against the floor. The sound was unremarkable on its own, the ordinary noise of someone standing up in a crowded room. But then another chair moved, and another. The string quartet's recording continued for exactly 4 more seconds before the sound technician at the audio board, a college senior named Adrian who was running the system for the first time without supervision, simply forgot to keep it running. The silence that followed was complete. Sebastian Drake stood in row 8 of Section D, center aisle. He was 51 years old, with the kind of build that had once been built for specific purposes and had since been maintained out of discipline rather than necessity. He wore the Navy service dress white uniform, white jacket, white trousers, white combination cap tucked under his left arm, gold shoulder boards bearing the 2.5 stripes of a commander, and above his left breast pocket, a column of ribbons that began with the Navy Cross and continued for 4 rows below it. He stood without expression and without hurry, the way he had stood at attention approximately 10,000 times in the course of a career that was not yet finished. On his left a man stood, on his right another, down the row 1 by 1, and then from adjacent rows 8 more men in the same white uniform, the same bearing, the same deliberate silence, 10 in total, rising in a sequence that was not choreographed but felt as though it had been. Because these were men who had moved together in darkness and noise and under conditions that no graduation ceremony could approximate. And that kind of training did not leave a person. It became posture. It becomes the way a man fills a room even when he is trying to do the opposite. The auditorium registered them the way a field registers a change in weather. First one person turning, then the ripple spreading outward in all directions until the entire 2,000-seat space had oriented itself toward the back of the hall. The murmuring died. Even the people who did not know what they were looking at understood that they were looking at something. Sebastian walked out of his row and into the center aisle. His footsteps on the polished concrete floor were the only sound in the building. He walked forward 8 rows without rushing, stopped and turned to face the front of the hall, toward the exit doors, toward Hunter and Connor, toward Jackson, who had not yet moved. When Sebastian spoke, he did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The acoustics of Whitmore Auditorium were excellent, and he had spent 2 decades giving orders in environments where a raised voice was a liability rather than an asset. "I apologize for the interruption," he said. The words were formal and unhurried. "My name is Sebastian Drake. I am a commander in the United States Navy, currently assigned to Naval Special Warfare Development Group." He paused. The silence held. "The man standing at those doors is Commander Jackson Cole, United States Navy, retired. He served for 21 years. He was a member of Naval Special Warfare, what most people know as the Navy SEALs, for 16 of those years." Sebastian looked directly at Hunter Briggs, then at Connor Walsh, with the particular quality of attention that high-rank military personnel develop. Not aggressive, not theatrical, simply total. "He is here today because his son is graduating from this university. That is the only reason. And I would like to say a few things about him, if this room will allow it." No one said it would not. Sebastian turned his gaze toward the assembled families, the faculty, the rows of waiting guests. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of specific memory rather than eulogy. In 2004, Jackson Cole led a 4-man element into Helmand Province under conditions that the mission brief had classified as extremely high risk. They were extracting a wounded intelligence officer who had been cut off from his team for 36 hours. The mission was completed. Everyone came home. Jackson received a commendation. He did not mention it to anyone outside the unit. "That was the first time I served alongside him." He was quiet for a moment, letting the arithmetic of the story settle. 36 hours, 1 man cut off, 4 going in to bring him out, before he continued. "In 2009, there was an operation in Kunar Province, Afghanistan, that was designated classified for 11 years and has since been partially declassified under the name Operation Hollow Ridge. I am permitted to speak about it in general terms. A group of 12 American civilians, journalists, aid workers, and 2 members of a humanitarian medical team had been taken by an armed faction and were being held in a compound in a valley with 1 approach corridor and no viable extraction point from the air. The assessment from command was that a ground insertion was possible but carried what was documented as an unacceptably high probability of casualties on both sides. Jackson Cole reviewed the assessment. He presented an alternative approach. It required his team to move on foot through 11 kilometers of contested terrain at night, breach the compound through a secondary structure, and move 12 non-combatants back to an extraction point before a window of less than 40 minutes closed. Sebastian stopped again. In the auditorium, no one moved. Jackson was shot twice during the breach, once in the left shoulder, once in the upper right thigh. He continued to direct his team and coordinate the civilian movement for the duration of the operation. All 12 civilians were extracted. All 4 members of his team came home. He was medevaced to a military hospital in Germany, where he spent 18 days. When he was well enough to write, his after-action report spent 11 pages on tactical analysis and 2 sentences on his own injuries. I read that report. I have read a lot of after-action reports in my career. I have never read one quite like it. He reached into the inside breast pocket of his jacket. He produced a folded document and opened it slowly. Jackson Cole was formally recommended for the Medal of Honor following Operation Hollow Ridge. The nomination was approved. A White House ceremony was scheduled. Jackson wrote a letter to the Secretary of the Navy requesting, respectfully, that the ceremony be waived and the decoration forwarded to his home address. His stated reason was that he had done nothing that any member of his team would not have done. The request was denied. A smaller ceremony was arranged. He attended for 14 minutes, accepted the decoration, thanked the presenting officer, and left. Sebastian refolded the paper. He put it back in his pocket. He retired from the Navy the following year. He opened an auto repair business in Raleigh, North Carolina. He has operated it for the past 14 years. Sebastian looked toward the exit doors one more time. He came here today to watch his son graduate. That is who you just walked out of this building. The silence lasted for 3 full seconds after he finished. Then Sebastian Drake straightened, raised his right hand to the brim of his cap, and held a salute. Precise, formal, the kind of salute that does not waver. Behind him, in an unhurried wave that moved from the center outward, 9 more men in white uniforms raised their hands to their caps. Jackson had not moved from the exit doors. He stood with his back still partially toward the hall, one hand against the push bar. The sound of the saluting, 10 sets of heels coming together, 10 white-sleeved arms lifting, reached him before he turned slowly. He looked at the 10 men in white at the back of the hall, and then he looked at the 2,000 faces between himself and them, and the expression face was not triumph and it was not relief, and it was not the expression of a man being vindicated in front of a crowd. It was something more complicated than any of those things, the expression of a man who had spent a long time making himself invisible, and who had just in the span of 4 minutes been made completely, irreversibly visible by people he trusted and loved, in the one room where he had most wanted not to need anything from anyone. He raised his right hand to his forehead, one salute returned, clean and complete. The applause began on the left side of the hall and moved like a current through water. No one planned it, no one led it simply found its direction and traveled. Within 10 seconds, the standing ovation had reached every section of Whitmore Auditorium. People stood because they could not think of any reason not to. The sound filled the building until the walls held it the way a vessel holds something it was made to carry. Margaret Harlow did not stand. She sat in the front row of Section A with her hands folded in her lap, and the sound of the ovation fell on her from all sides, and she looked at the empty stage with the careful neutrality of a person trying very hard not to be seen looking anywhere in particular. The woman seated next to her, a fellow board member named Eleanor Vance, stood with everyone else and did not look at Margaret at all. That deliberate absence of eye contact said more than any conversation could have. Cameron Brooks had stepped back against the side wall. His clipboard was under his arm. He was looking at the floor. Diana Ashworth walked out from the stage wing. She did not take the podium. She simply walked down the 3 steps at the side of the stage and across the main floor toward the exit doors, moving with the purposeful calm of someone who has arrived at a decision and intends to act on it before she can second-guess herself. She reached Jackson while the applause was still ongoing and stopped in front of him. She was a head shorter than he was. She looked up at him without flinching. "Commander Cole," she said. Her voice was steady, though the people closest to them could hear the effort in that steadiness. "I owe you an apology on behalf of this institution. What happened tonight should not have happened, and I am sorry that it did." She extended her hand. "There is a seat in the front row of Section A on the aisle that I would like very much for you to take." Jackson shook her hand. "Any seat is fine." That was all he said. 4 words. Diana Ashworth would quote them verbatim in the public statement she released the following morning, and in every subsequent interview, because she understood, as people do when they encounter something genuine, that the right response to the moment was to let it speak without addition. Jackson followed her to the seat in Section A. He sat down. He folded his hands in his lap. The music resumed. The ceremony began. Hunter Briggs and Connor Walsh were summoned by Cameron Brooks to a corridor off the east wing before the opening remarks had concluded. There was no raised voice. Cameron was not the kind of man who raised his voice when he was genuinely concerned. He was the kind of man who got very quiet, and he was very quiet that morning in the corridor outside Whitmore Auditorium. He collected their event credentials. He told them to go home and wait to hear from the university's legal office. They went. Cameron's own conversation with the university's general counsel took place 4 days later. The finding was straightforward. He had acted on an implied directive from a board member without documented authorization, had deployed staff to remove a credentialed guest based on factors that had no basis in university policy, and had failed to intervene when those staff members fabricated a procedural requirement to accomplish that removal. He submitted his resignation the following week, before the formal termination process could conclude. It was, in its way, the most honest thing he did throughout the entire episode. Charlotte Reeves uploaded the video at 12:17 in the afternoon, while the ceremony was still ongoing. The clip ran 4 minutes and 22 seconds. It began with the moment Hunter and Connor flanked Jackson at the exit doors, continued through Sebastian Drake's full address, and ended with the salute and the standing ovation. Charlotte added a single line of caption and no additional commentary. By the time the graduates were throwing their caps at 3:45, the clip had been viewed 600,000 times. By midnight, the number was 9 million. By the following morning, it had crossed 22 million across the platforms that carried it, and the emails arriving in Westfield University's communications office had filled 3 separate inboxes. The Board of Trustees convened an emergency session 48 hours after the ceremony. It was the first meeting in 11 years at which Margaret Harlow did not sit at the head of the table. She entered the room, set a single envelope on the surface in front of her chair, and did not sit down at all. The envelope contained her letter of resignation, effective immediately. She offered 3 sentences of explanation and then left. The board accepted the resignation with a vote of 8-1. The dissenting vote was her own, which she cast in absentia through her attorney, on grounds that were not disclosed in the public record and that most people who followed the story did not spend much time trying to understand. What the public record did note was that the board simultaneously voted to commission an independent review of all event access policies and to issue a formal institutional apology to Jackson Cole, which Diana Ashworth drafted personally and which Jackson Cole received, read once, and filed in a drawer in his garage. He found Sebastian in the parking lot after the ceremony, standing beside a rental car in the far row, jacket unbuttoned, cap under his arm, looking like a man who had completed a task he had been planning for some time and was now simply waiting to see what came next. Sebastian had always been comfortable with the in-between spaces, the silence after the noise, the pause after the action. It was one of the things that had made him exceptionally good at his work and occasionally difficult to be around at dinner parties. Jackson walked over without hurry. The lot was still full of families moving slowly in the afternoon heat, talking, taking photographs, looking for their cars. Neither man spoke immediately. They stood together the way people stand when the words can wait and the standing is itself sufficient. "I didn't know you were coming," Jackson said finally. "I know you didn't." Sebastian looked out across the lot. "Elijah contacted me about 6 weeks ago. He said you were coming alone and that you had never told him about any of it, and that he wanted there to be at least one day where someone told the story out loud. He was very specific. He said he wasn't trying to embarrass you. He just wanted someone to say it." Jackson was quiet for a moment. A family passed behind them, 2 young children running ahead of their parents, laughing about something, and then the noise faded back into the general hum of the lot. "That kid," Jack said. Just those 2 words, in the even tone of a man who was not going to say any more than that, because any more than that was not something he knew how to manage in a parking lot in the afternoon with Sebastian Drake watching him. Sebastian almost smiled. "He has your instincts. He knows when something needs to happen and he makes it happen. You should be proud of him." "I am." "Then tell him that." Jackson looked at him. Sebastian looked back with the directness of someone who has known a man long enough to have earned the right to say the obvious thing without apology. "You going to be all right?" Sebastian asked. "I'm going to open the garage tomorrow morning," Jackson said, "same as always." "That's not what I asked." Another pause. Somewhere across the parking lot a car horn honked twice and someone laughed. The afternoon light was coming in at a low angle now, gold and generous, the kind of light that makes even parking lots look briefly like somewhere worth being. "Yeah," Jackson said, "I'll be all right." Sebastian nodded. He put his cap back on, adjusted the brim once with 2 fingers in the gesture of a man setting something into place with the same precision he applied to everything. They shook hands. Not the brief social handshake of acquaintance, but the grip of people who have stood in the same darkness and come back from it, which is a different thing entirely. Jackson walked back to his truck. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine. Through the windshield, the last of the families were filtering out of the lot. The graduating class had dispersed into the ordinary afternoon. The building behind him was returning to itself. The Whitmore Auditorium, a brick and limestone structure with a plaque by the door, host to a ceremony that had just become, against all expectation, the most watched event this university had ever produced. He started the truck. He pulled out of the lot and onto the street. He turned the radio on. A country station playing something old that he could not have named. He drove. The garage was 11 minutes away. Tomorrow there were 3 vehicles booked for service, a phone message from a regular customer about a transmission issue, and a parts order he needed to check on. The things that needed doing were clear, and he was good at doing them, and the drive home was exactly long enough to let the day settle into the place where days go when they are finished. He thought about Elijah for a moment, not the image of him on the stage, not the cap and gown, but the handwriting on the notacard. The blocky, unhurried letters, the single sentence. He thought about what Sebastian had said. He just wanted someone to say it. Jackson understood that impulse, even if he would never have acted on it himself. He had spent 21 years doing things he could not speak about, and then another 14 years not speaking about them out of habit that had calcified into something closer to principle. He had never considered that his silence might land on his son not as modesty but as distance, that a boy growing up with a father who carried something enormous and unnamed might spend years wondering whether he himself was a reason the weight was never put down. He had not considered that. He was considering it now. The garage appeared at the end of the block, the faded sign catching the last of the afternoon light, the two bay doors closed and patient. Jackson pulled into the gravel lot and turned off the engine. He sat in the quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled out his phone, a small, practical device with a cracked corner on the screen that he had not gotten around to replacing, and opened a message to Elijah. He typed slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a man for whom words were not instinctive tools. He did not write much. He had never been able to write much. But what he wrote was true, and it was specific, and it said the thing that needed saying in a way that did not dress it up or walk around it. He sent it. He put the phone in his pocket. He got out of the truck, unlocked the garage, and went inside. The concrete floor was exactly as he had left it that morning, swept, orderly, the smell of oil and steel that was not unpleasant to a man who had spent his best years in harder places. He did not turn on the main lights. The light coming through the small windows above the bay doors was enough. He pulled a stool out from under the workbench and sat. He did not turn on the radio or look at his phone or reach for any of the tasks that tomorrow would require. He just sat in the quiet of the place he had built, in the work he had chosen, in the life that was not the one most people would have expected for a man with his history, and he let the day be what it had been, without trying to make it into something smaller or something larger than that. Greatness does not announce itself. It does not dress for the occasion or clear its throat before speaking. It exists in the accumulated weight of choices made when no one was watching, in missions without names, in sacrifices without audiences, in mornings spent in front of a mirror pulling on the best shirt a man owns because a son asked him to show up, and showing up is the only thing that was ever asked. The people in Whitmore Auditorium would carry that afternoon with them for the rest of their lives. Each of them understanding something slightly different about what they had witnessed, and all of them understanding the same essential thing. Jackson Cole had not needed any of it, not the salute, not the standing ovation, not the video that crossed 20 million views before the week was out. He had needed one seat in one row in one building, on one afternoon, because his son was graduating. The world found out who he was anyway, and the world for once had the good sense to stand up.